Hi, how's it going? My name is Charlie. Happy 2021. Today I'm going to tell you about all the books that I read this year. I believe that I read 26 books this year. I have slowly started getting back into reading again after not really reading a whole lot in high school. Books for like my whole life in middle school and before then. So I'm kind of getting back into reading. The year before, I think I only read like 12 books, so I was really excited this year to kind of double my book count. I want to share all the books that I read with you, and I give them a star rating. So it's going to be a 5-star rating system. I'm going to rate each one out of 5 stars, and I've got a good mix of stuff here. I'm excited. I kind of have some like Belle vibes going on today, and I kind of love it. So I have all my books backwards so you can't see what they are. So you'll watch the video. It's gonna be a good time. It's gonna be a long one because I read a lot and I want to tell you about them, if I recommend them, so on and so forth. Just as some context, I was a literature major at the beginning of 2020, and then I switched majors to liberal studies and early childhood education. I haven't read a lot of books for school since the beginning of the year. At the beginning of the year, I was reading a lot of Shakespeare because that was what I was into and taking classes for. So I have, I think, 5 Shakespeare plays here. And okay, before all of my fellow literature geeks come for me, I am going to continue to rate the Shakespeare plays along with the YA and like children's novels that I read. I'm going to be rating like Macbeth, and I'm also going to be rating Winnie the Pooh. And it's gonna be on the same scale. So if I give a book that you don't like a higher star rating than Shakespeare, or maybe a book that is not, you know, as classic as a Shakespeare, this is just like my enjoyment factor. Also, you have to take into consideration, like, it was for school and I had to write papers about it. There's a lot of factors for each book. I also include comics and graphic novels because I love comics and graphic novels, and I am including audiobooks as well, because if you don't include audiobooks in your reading list, that's a little ableist. So let's do this. Hi, editing me here real quick before we get started. I know I'm like explaining a lot before I even talk about books, but this is gonna have spoilers in it for certain books. So if it was written like 50 plus years ago, I'm gonna have spoilers in it. So yeah, so there are some spoilers for certain things, like Shakespeare plays. I'm gonna spoil like the plots, but honestly they were written in the 1500s, so I don't really feel that it's not like it just came out and you haven't had a chance to read it yet. I am including the Avatar: The Last Airbender comics, which does spoil the end of the Avatar: The Last Airbender cartoon from Nickelodeon, so beware. But yeah, that's my spoiler warning. Watch at your own caution. I don't want any comments like, you spoiled Othello for me, you spoiled Macbeth. It's like, okay, it was written in the 1500s. I don't know what to tell. Let's go. Starting with January. January was good. January I started at UC Santa Cruz. I was only there for a couple months before the pandemic hit, and then I switched colleges and majors, but we'll get there. We'll get there in March. But January was good. I was taking some literature courses, including a class all about Shakespeare, and the first play we read was Twelfth Night. Twelfth Night is one of my favorite Shakespeare plays. It is a comedy, and you know what they say about comedies. In Shakespeare's comedies, everyone ends up wed. In the tragedies, everyone ends up dead. So you know this is gonna be a happy ending play. It's pretty easy to tell which ones are gonna be the happy endings based on, you know, if they're a comedy or a tragedy. Twelfth Night is obviously by William Shakespeare. They are assuming that it was published / first performed in 1601 to 1602, somewhere around there. A lot of Shakespeare plays are kind of hard to place when they were published, but that's around the time that it was published. Twelfth Night also has another title called What You Will, but it's mostly known by its title, Twelfth Night. It's a romantic comedy. The play centers around twins. Shakespeare loves twins. Viola and Sebastian. They are separated in a ship, like a shipwreck that happens. The ship that they're on is wrecked and they are separated. Viola goes under disguise as a man named Cesario, and she falls in love with a duke whose name is Duke Orsino. He is in love with another person whose name is Olivia, and upon meeting Viola, who is disguised as Cesario, Olivia falls in love with Viola, thinking that she is Cesario. And so all sorts of comedy ensues. There's lots of love triangles, there's like secret notes and deception. It's very fun. I really did love 12th Night, and I gave it 4.5 out of 5 stars. I have seen it performed I think 3 times. I am a big Shakespeare girl. My family is a big Shakespeare family. We've gone to the Ashland Shakespeare Festival in Oregon before. We did Shakespeare reading groups when I was homeschooled, so I am well versed in the Bard. I like to reserve my full 5-star for my absolute faves. So yeah, moving on. Next up on my list is East of Eden by John Steinbeck. East of Eden was published in 1952 by the American author John Steinbeck, who writes a lot of his stories based in Central Valley, California, which is really close to where I live. So I have a lot of, like, I don't know, nostalgia when reading his books, even though they were written way before I was born. A lot of the scenery just makes me feel like going on drives with my family when we'd go to Southern California, or when I go visit my boyfriend in Southern California now. So I really love his scenery, imagery, descriptions, because he really loves lengthy descriptions. As you can see by this chonky book, East of Eden is actually the second John Steinbeck book that I've read. It's not my fave. Obviously, Of Mice and Men is my favorite. I talked about that in the favorite books that I had to read in school video, but Of Mice and Men is also on my top fave books of all time. But East of Eden is also really great. It did take me a year to get through, and I just happened to finish it in January. I started it previous January and just plugged along very slowly because, as you can see, it is very dense. I have a really hard time reading big blocks of text. I tend to skip around and read a lot of dialogue and then go back to the beginning of the page and read the descriptions. And I skip around on the page a lot, which I don't know if that's normal, but I've done it since I've started reading. And one of my goals this year for reading is to slow down a little bit and try to not skip around on the page, because I tend to spoil things for myself and it makes it harder to read books with great description that I really want to get, you know, reading more. East of Eden, let's talk about East of Eden. I think this book is like 700 pages. Yeah, my copy is 700 pages. Also, I bought this at the Shakespeare and Company bookstore in France when I was 17, and I didn't read it up until I was in my 20s, but that's okay. So John Steinbeck considered this to be his like magnum opus. Like, this was his like life's work book. Like, this is the one, if someone asked him what he did, he would say, I wrote East of Eden. This was like his book. And it is primarily set in Salinas Valley, California, which I mentioned earlier, and it's set between the beginning of the 20th century and World War I, so the beginning of the 1900s, which, as some of you may know, is kind of my sweet spot historical era. I really love like late 1800s, early 1900s. That's like my jam. I love that. Even though it's primarily set in California, there are a lot of chapters that are in like Connecticut and Massachusetts as well, so it's just all over the place. US, early 1900s. A lot happens in this book. I have a really hard time kind of finding a succinct plot, but it follows 2 brothers. It's kind of got this like Cain and Abel biblical sort of thing going on. Lots of biblical references, lots of like deep imagery and description, and some of the themes are like the struggle for greatness and success, the capacity for like self-destruction of oneself. There's themes of love and lust. There's a lot going on in this book. It is definitely pretty dark at some points. I was a little surprised at how dark that it got. My dad is a big John Steinbeck fan, and so I felt like I had to actually read it, and I did end up buying Grapes of Wrath actually, which I hope to read some point soon. It's not on my book list for 2021 because I think it's a little ambitious to get done this next year with the other things I want to read, but I do hope to read it in the future. East of Eden I did enjoy. If you want to read Steinbeck though, I highly recommend Of Mice and Men, like I mentioned earlier. It's a lot shorter, but you still get the same Salinas Valley, like Central Valley, California vibe. It's got a very similar vibe, but it's much shorter, and I still really liked East of Eden, and I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars. Next up on our list is another Shakespeare play. This one is Much Ado About Nothing, obviously by William Shakespeare. So Much Ado About Nothing, it's assumed that it was published / first performed in 1589 to 1599, somewhere around there. Much Ado About Nothing is another comedy. It is another romantic comedy. It centers around 4 primary characters, but my 2 favorite characters are Benedict and Beatrice. They are very witty, outgoing. So Benedict and Beatrice are tricked into confessing love for one another because they think that the other one loves them. They're tricked into this by Beatrice's cousin, whose name is Hero, and she is going to be getting married to a man named Claudio. However, Beatrice and Benedict's story is kind of the side plot, but it kind of becomes the main plot depending on the production that you see of it, because it is the more funny plot and the more serious plot is supposed to be the main plot, and that is about Hero getting dismissed at the altar. It is very intense. There's a lot of talk about purity and chastity. However, we know that it's a comedy, so everybody ends up happy in the end. I do like Much Ado About Nothing. I have seen it performed. I've seen a couple movie versions as well. I actually really like the David Tennant version. I think his name is David Tennant. Is his name David Tennant? David Tennant, the doctor. There's a version, like a live production that he is in, that is on YouTube that I highly recommend. I actually found it really funny. He does a great Benedict. I enjoyed reading it. I also gave it a 4 out of 5. I feel like it's really hard to give anything Shakespeare lower than a 4 out of 5, but we'll get there because there is one, and it is that. My foot is falling asleep. Hold on. Oh, there's me in the background wiggling my foot. That's cool. All right, next up on the list is actually a reread, and it is Stargirl by Jerry Spinelli. Stargirl was published in the year 2000. A little background, Stargirl for many years was my favorite book. I told everybody that it was my favorite book. It was my #1. I have a bookshelf where I have everything organized by favorites, and it was the first book on the bookshelf. When I first read it, I think I was 11, and it was like mind-blowing to me. So Stargirl is a coming-of-age story, and it's from the perspective of a boy named Leo who is in high school. Leo likes to conform. Leo wants to fit in at his school. He doesn't want to stand out, and he used to stand out, and he had a lot of funky, quirky attributes, and slowly over time as he got older, he just started to kind of conform into what the high school expected him to be. It takes place in Micah, Arizona in the early 2000s. One day there's this new girl that comes to school, and she was previously homeschooled, and she is self-named Stargirl. And I would like to point out that this does have a lot of Manic Pixie Dream Girl qualities, like, you know, the 500 Days of Summer and all of that. I would love to talk to someone more about this. I was very into the Manic Pixie Dream Girl trope when I was younger because I wanted to be that, especially because I was a homeschooled girl who started public school in 8th grade for the first time, and I took a lot of inspiration from Stargirl on my first few days of school. Like, I really wanted to be her and just bring this like light into my middle school. That didn't happen. However, I did conform into the school just like Leo did. It still was a really great read. It brought me right back to middle school me. However, my star rating of it did demote significantly. I just didn't get as much out of it this following read, and I kind of wish that I hadn't reread it. However, at the same time, I'm glad that I did, because then I won't recommend it to as many people. I still think that it's worth a read, but it's not my fave. I gave it 3.5 out of 5 stars, which is crazy. If you haven't read the book and you aren't sure if you want to, you know, spend the time reading it, it's pretty short. I mean, it is a YA novel, a tiny one. If you do want to kind of get an idea of the story, I do feel like the Disney Plus version with Grace Vanderwall that came out at the beginning of the year actually does a fairly good job. I read the book because the film was coming out and I wanted to reread it before I watched it, and I did enjoy the movie. I thought that it was good, but again, I still have that kind of, is this promoting a Manic Pixie Dream Girl trope? I don't know, but I'll leave a video here. I don't know if I can do that. If not, I'll put it in the description, kind of describing the Manic Pixie Dream Girl trope and why it is harmful. So yeah, it's something that I'm taking a lot into consideration both when I read and when I write. 3.5 out of 5 stars. Still pretty good. So now we are into February, and the first book that I read in February is No One Is Too Small to Make a Difference by Greta Thunberg. This one was published in 2019. This book was gifted to me for Christmas last year by my sibling who works at a bookstore. They bought it for me. This book is a collection of, I think, almost all or most of Greta Thunberg's speeches. Greta Thunberg, if you don't know, she's a teenage girl from Sweden who has been protesting and on a climate strike from school to raise awareness about climate change, and she has spoken all over the world at different conferences. She has been the one who has led the school strike for climate that happens every Friday, and she is one of my idols. I really love everything that she does and everything that she talks about. However, I did find this book somewhat repetitive because the speeches included a lot of similar things from the previous speech. So each chapter is a separate speech that she's given, and a lot of the information is repeated, which makes sense because every time you give a speech, you kind of want to catch people up on what you're talking about. But also, as someone who follows her journey and her public appearances really closely, I knew a lot of these speeches already, so it was just kind of reiterating stuff that I already knew, and I don't think I particularly learned anything from this book. However, I'm so happy that I have it as kind of like a memento of her journey in activism and just to support her journey in general. I love her, but this book didn't particularly do much for me. It took me like maybe 40 minutes to read the whole thing, so it's not like I like wasted my time. So if you're on the fence about buying this book, I recommend just watching her speeches on YouTube. You can hear a lot more of the passion in her voice and her performance when you actually see her speak versus when you read it. However, if you do want to support her like me and have this little memento about her, I'm happy that I have it. I gave this book a 3 out of 5 stars. However, I give her speeches a 5 out of 5. Next up is another reread, and this is another play that I read for school. This one is Othello by William Shakespeare. This is the second time that I've read this play. I read it sophomore year of high school. However, I missed a lot because I was not doing so hot in school sophomore year, and I missed a lot of stuff, so I didn't get as in-depth to it as I wish that I had. I did get a lot more in-depth to it this year, and let me tell you, Othello is one of my favorites. It is assumed that Othello was published slash first performed. So it's assumed that Othello was first performed slash published in the year 1603, and its alternate title slash continued title, The Tragedy of Othello, the Moor of Venice. So our two central characters in Othello are Othello, who's our title character, and Iago, who is our antagonist. However, we get a lot more of Iago on stage slash on the page than we do Othello, which is great because Iago is one of the most iconic villains of all time. Othello is a general in the Venetian army, and Iago is kind of like his right-hand man. So there are a lot of themes of racism, love, jealousy, deception. I feel like a lot of people know the plot of Othello, especially if you went to high school in the US, or I think in the UK they read Shakespeare as part of the school curriculum too. I know in high school in the US we read a lot of Shakespeare. One of my favorite Shakespeare plays of all time, if you, once again, I'm just gonna keep like plugging my last book video that I did. If you watched that video, you would know that my two top Shakespeare plays are Hamlet and Midsummer Night's Dream. Those are my two favorite, comedy and tragedy. However, Othello is way up there as well. Othello, I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. I have loved every production I've seen of it, every movie I've seen of it. Othello has been done many different ways, and it translates into contemporary work really seamlessly. One of those stories where you see it referenced everywhere in contemporary media as well. I highly recommend reading Othello if you haven't, and if you're someone who has a difficult time starting to read Shakespeare, I recommend listening to it as an audio version. There are free versions on Hoopla and on YouTube, so you can absolutely listen to it and get the passion and the actors' voices as well. But Hamlet, I'm just talking about Hamlet again because I love it so much. But Othello is a fantastic play, and I definitely recommend it, and it was probably my favorite play that I read during my Shakespeare class. 5 out of 5 stars, of course. So my next play that I have, it's another, well, my next book I have is also a play, another tragedy by Shakespeare, and it is Macbeth. Macbeth was presumed to be first performed slash published in 1606. I really love the tragedies in Shakespeare. I love the popular tragedies, and you know, I used to really hate that I loved popular stuff so much, but like sometimes there's a reason that it's popular, and that's because it's good, so I'm just gonna like it if it's good, you know? Our title character Macbeth is a Scottish general, and our entire story takes place in Scotland. Macbeth is under the rule of King Duncan, and at the beginning of the play we have 3 witches that show up. They are called the Weird Sisters. The witches tell Macbeth somewhat of like a prophecy that they see him being king. And so with this prophecy and encouragement from his wife, Lady Macbeth, who is by far one of the best female characters that Shakespeare has written, in my opinion, Lady Macbeth and Macbeth decide to murder King Duncan. So after killing King Duncan, Macbeth does become king, and it follows this series of murders and themes of guilt that both Macbeth and Lady Macbeth have about killing the king. There is a lot of violence in this play, like a lot, so be prepared. I will say one of my favorite versions of Macbeth that I have ever seen is called Throne of Blood, which is a Japanese film. I highly recommend this film. It is so good. Even Even if you aren't a Shakespeare or a Macbeth fan, this movie is just insanely good. I just cannot recommend it enough. But I gave Macbeth a 5 out of 5 stars. I don't know how I could give it anything else. Macbeth is just iconic. It is so good. So now we are on to March, and as we know, March of 2020 was a very exciting month for all of us. But at the beginning of March of 2020, I finished a book that I had been reading since January, and it was a book that I had actually bought also at the Shakespeare Book Company when I was 17, and that is Wildwood. Oh my gosh, this book. Wildwood is written by a man named Colin Meloy and is illustrated by his wife Carson Ellis, and it was published in 2011. I just kind of want to flex my Shakespeare Company stamp again because I can. So this is obviously a pretty thick book, but it's intended for a middle school age audience, and you know, I have a very eclectic book genres that I like, but I do really love middle reader books. This is Wildwood, which is the first book in the Wildwood Chronicles, and it is a children's fantasy novel, which is right up my alley. So it's inspired by classic fantasy novels and folktales, so it includes a lot of tropes, but they're kind of done up and kind of redone in a more modern and contemporary way. So it's the story of two 7th graders whose names are Pooh and Curtis, and they are on a adventure into these forbidden kind of secret woods to look for Pooh's baby brother, who has been taken by a flock of crows. I guess it'd be a murder of, are they ravens? No, they're crows. That's a murder of crows. Did you know that? And he is taken by a murder of crows. Pooh and Curtis go into the woods to save him. So they learn about this like magical parallel universe that happens in these woods that no one in their town knew existed. It's full of like magical creatures, talking animals, a whole kingdom, and it is fantastic. Also, the book takes place in Portland, Oregon, which is a place that's very near and dear to my heart. So if you're looking for something really magical, Wildwood is great. I haven't read anything after it because, as you may know, we are at the beginning of March here and things are going to take a wild ride in just a couple weeks. I didn't get to finish this series, but I do hope to in the future. And I gave Wildwood a 4.5 out of 5 stars. Also, the images in this are like absolute 5 out of 5. They're just so gorgeous. Good job, Carson. Carson and Colin, good duo. All right, here we go. It's time for everyone to roast me for giving a bad review to a Shakespeare play. We have Antony and Cleopatra by William Shakespeare. This was assumed to be published or first performed in 1607, and it follows the love story of Antony and Cleopatra. Now, this is supposed to be kind of historical from the time of the Sicilian revolt to Cleopatra's suicide. Now, that's not a spoiler. We know that that happens. So we're good on that. That's history. We're good. However, this play is very strange to me because it has so many tropes of Shakespeare comedies and tragedies all roped into one, and I think that that's why I just didn't jive with it. I felt like it wasn't as like succinct as a lot of his other plays. It felt like there were a lot of loose ends, and maybe it's just because that I wasn't familiar with this play before reading it. Like the other 4 I had seen and read some of them beforehand, so this was the first time that I had like delved into Antony and Cleopatra. However, it just wasn't for me. Like the only characters I can remember are Antony and Cleopatra, and it just wasn't that memorable. So I did give Antony and Cleopatra a 3 out of 5 stars. Now, let me explain. It just wasn't my favorite. Moving on. Okay, this is the lowest rated book on my list, and I think people might roast me for it, and I don't even have it anymore because I sold it on my Depop because that's how much I didn't like it, and the only reason that I've given it a little bit of a rating is because I feel like I have to, because it's such a renowned book, but I just really hated it. So this is The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho, and it was first published in 1988. Now, I don't have this book to show you, but this is the photo of the book, and I didn't like it. It was written, like I said, by Paulo Coelho, who is a Brazilian author, and it was translated into many different languages after its success when it was published in its original language, Portuguese. So this is an allegorical novel. Stay with me. It follows a young Spanish shepherd who's from Andalusia, which is in the south of Spain, and his journey to the pyramids of Egypt when he's looking for buried treasure. Now, here's the thing. If you want to read The Alchemist, I recommend reading The Little Prince, because The Little Prince did it better. I had no emotion to the protagonist at all. I didn't care about him really at all. So this is actually the second time I read this book. The first time I read it, I was kind of like, eh. I read it kind of quick. I didn't really analyze it at all, just because it was recommended to me so many times, and it was just kind of like an eh. I would have given it like a 3 out of 5. However, I read it for a class for a professor that I hated, just continued to find dislike to this book, and now I feel like I have kind of a grudge against this book because of the professor and the way that the class was run. And the way that we delved into this book made me find things in it that I liked even less, really pushed me to realize how much more I like The Little Prince, and I feel like The Little Prince did it like better. Like I really do think that The Little Prince is better in that regard. However, I totally understand if people love this book, and like if you love it, that's great. I didn't, and I sold it because I don't want to read it again. I understand why it's such a popular book. Would love to read more books by Brazilian authors that were translated from its original Portuguese. However, this was just not the one for me. It felt like it was almost trying too hard to be something good. So I gave it a 1.5 out of 5 stars. Next is another book that I did not decide to keep, and it is Everything Everything by Nicola Yoon, and it was published in 2015. This is a YA novel. It's kind of like a love story, and I personally love contemporary YA. I think it's really fun. It makes me feel like I'm in high school again, and I do really enjoy reading it, but I kind of enjoy them the same way that I enjoy watching Riverdale. I don't enjoy them necessarily super seriously, and I kind of take them at face value, and that's enough for me, and I enjoy it and then I move on. It's nothing that I'm gonna like love forever, but I do enjoy them. So Everything Everything by Nicola Yoon, who is a Jamaican American author, was published in 2015, and it is a romance YA love story. So the novel centers around 18-year-old girl named Madeline. She is being treated for severe combined immunodeficiency, also known as a bubble baby disease, which means she can't go outside. So she's kept inside at home in Los Angeles, California, and she lives with her mom, and then she has a in-house nurse who stays with them. The story kind of begins when a cute heartthrob boy moves in next door. I read this book because I wanted to watch the movie version that came out. I was very bored. This was pre-quarantine, but I was in my dorm room at Santa Cruz, and I hadn't made very many friends yet. I didn't end up making very many friends. I was bored and I needed something to entertain me, and so I'm happy that I read this book, and then I also got to watch the movie. I did enjoy both of them. However, it didn't make like, it wasn't very like profound. It was just, you know, a fun love story. So I gave it a 3 out of 5 stars. I would recommend it if you're looking for just like a fun love story to read, and it went really quick. I think I read it in like a day and a half, so definitely enjoyed it, but not gonna make my top list, and I didn't keep the book. So now we've moved on to April, and this is when quarantine is in full swing. Starting at the beginning of quarantine, my book reading was kind of all over the place, but the first book that I read was Eleanor and Park by Rainbow Rowell, which was published in 2012. So I bought this book in 2012 and just never got around to reading it. I think I gave it a try once and then didn't end up finishing it. And I would like to make a disclaimer that this book has been in a lot of controversy, and I'm going to link a couple videos down below as to why and why I think that it's justified. Pretty racist, which I didn't know until I read it. Yeah, I highly recommend watching the videos down below as to why this book has been in this controversy and being boycotted by many people. Let me tell you a little bit about it. It takes place in Omaha, Nebraska in the 1980s. Follows around our 2 teenage protagonists, a girl named Eleanor and a boy named Park, who are kind of seen as like the outcasts of their school, and they end up meeting each other on the school bus, and they bond over music and comic books, and they end up falling in love. So I highly recommend watching the videos about this book. I've also decided to not include a star rating for this book, but I highly recommend checking out the videos that I've left in the description down below to get a clearer picture. I don't want to delve too much into it in this video because that would take a very long time, so check out the ones in the description. The next book on my list I actually have again, so now I can actually show you the books. It is Bruiser by Neal Shusterman. So I bought this book at a thrift store and it didn't have a cover on it. I think I bought it for like $1, which is crazy. But it was published in 2010. I love Neal Shusterman. I really loved Unwind as a middle schooler. It was one of my favorites. I loved it so much. So I was really excited to kind of revisit his writing style and the switch perspectives, which I'm a sucker for switch perspective writing. It is a young adult contemporary novel. The story follows twins, again, twins, Bronte and Tennyson, who are in high school. And Bronte starts dating a kind of known bad boy at the school whose name is Bruiser, and a lot of people call him Bruiser. And obviously that's where the book's namesake comes from. Tennyson, who's very protective over his sister Bronte, he gets really nervous about her dating this guy who he thinks is going to be very dangerous. However, he's kind of one of those like teddy bear characters who's really sweet and is very empathetic, and like literally empathetic, which if you've read the book you would know. But he has a very mysterious life and past and present, and so the story is about Bronte and Bruiser having a relationship, but also it's about so much more. It's got a very magical element to it, and I really enjoyed reading this book. However, it wasn't one that like I'm thinking about all the time, and I've given it a 3.5 out of 5 stars, and I am keeping it, so maybe I'll reread it one day or share with a friend. So the next book slash play on my list is called Fences by August Wilson. I read this book for my Disability in Contemporary Media class that I took at UC Santa Cruz. I did really enjoy this play. However, there were a couple things that I felt a little like funky about. So it was written in the 1980s, 1985, and it was during the time when the 50s were really big in the 1980s. The story takes place in the 1950s. So it focuses on the Black American experience. So the play examines race and racism, family dynamic, disability, and parents' expectations of their children. So I watched the film, and I did really enjoy the film, and I enjoyed reading the play as well. I'm not really sure if I enjoyed the disability representation in this book. I am happy that there was disability representation. As I'm not part of the disabled community, I don't really want to say if this is positive representation or not. We did have some conversations in class about how the particular disabled character was represented. However, it was an enjoyable play to read and movie to watch, and if you aren't interested in reading the play, the movie is very good as well. I gave it a 3.5 out of 5 stars, and I do not have a copy anymore because I rented it. That was everything that I read in April, and I actually didn't end up reading anything in May. May was kind of a tricky month for me, but now we are on to June. So the only book that I read in June, which was much needed after kind of a difficult month, was a book that I've had for a long time, and it was a very light and fun read for me. It was the Winnie the Pooh collection by A.A. Milne. So I've had this book for a few years. I bought it when I worked at a toy store, and we had a little book section. I really love Winnie the Pooh. As you might know, I have the whole collection of stuffies. I have many of the original Winnie the Pooh books that I've collected from vintage stores and stuff, and it's really special to me, and it was really special to me as a kid, and so it was really fun to read this collection of older stories that aren't ones that I'm as familiar with. I was really surprised at how many like guns there are. Like they use like a rifle, and Christopher Robin says some pretty insensitive things at some points. All in all, the drawings are amazing. The writing is very witty and funny, especially as an adult reader. It's hilarious. This particular collection was published in 2009. However, the original Winnie the Pooh collection was published in the 1920s, which of course, as I say over and over again, is my sweet spot of time period. I do really love this collection, and it makes me really happy to own it and, you know, add to my whole Winnie the Pooh collection. So I gave this a 4 out of 5 stars. It was just a sweet, nice read and really nice distraction during a really tough month for me in May, and it was a great, you know, way to get me back into reading for the rest of the summer. The first book that I read in July was a book that I had bought years previous, and it is called Symptoms of Being Human by Jeff Garvin. This book was published in 2016, and it centers around our protagonist, whose name is Riley, who is a gender fluid teenager. Riley's gender that was assigned at birth is never disclosed in the story, which gives the reader this viewpoint of Riley that is truly androgynous, which is how Riley presents themselves. And it's just amazingly written, and I love it so much. When they're talking about Riley getting dressed for an event, they describe the clothing that their parents are forcing them to wear as like strictly gendered, but they never describe if the clothing for the formal event is a suit or a dress. So it keeps it really ambiguous, which I personally love, because then we don't put on any of these expectations of gender to Riley, or what Riley may look like based on the gender idea that we have of what a male teenager or female teenager looks like, which I love so much. Riley starts a blog at the beginning about being a gender fluid teenager, and there's another side to the story where Riley's parents are involved in politics, and Riley is really wanting to be the perfect child for their parents, for their dad, who is running for re-election. Involves a lot of LGBTQ culture, which I really love as part of the community myself, getting to see it, but also reading a book about a gender fluid character is the first time I've read a story that has a gender fluid or non-binary character, and it was just really amazing to read. However, I do want to note that Jeff Garvin, the author of this, is not LGBT or gender fluid, so this book is not written from the perspective of a gender fluid person, so keep that in mind. If you are looking for a book that is written from the perspective of a gender fluid person, I highly recommend the book George by Alex Gino. Alex is a queer and gender non-conforming person, and they write the book George about a transgender 4th grader, and I highly recommend that book for any age. I think it is a fantastic book. I obviously don't know a lot about Jeff. I did do some research and what Jeff's pronouns are, and that he uses he, him, and that he is not part of the LGBTQ community, so take that for what you will. However, as its own entity, I did really love Symptoms of Being Human, and I do recommend it for anyone who's interested in a fun read. It talks a lot about gender, but it also is just about Riley's life, which I really loved. Riley is a really great character as well. I feel like Riley's really well-rounded, and they felt very much like a teenager. You know, they make mistakes, they aren't perfect, but I do really love this book. So I gave Symptoms of Human a 4 out of 5 stars. Did I say it was published in 2016? It was published in 2016, which I think is around the time that I bought it, and it's been sitting on my bookshelf ever since. So in August, we have some audiobooks because I was very busy in August. And so the first audiobook that I listened to in August was So You Want to Talk About Race by Ijeoma Olu, which was published in 2018. I don't use Audible. It is owned by its parent company, Amazon, and I choose not to support Amazon. However, if you're looking for a free version of Audible, I highly recommend Hoopla, which I know is available in the US. I'm not sure about other countries. However, in the US, I use my library card number for my local library, and I have free access to audiobooks and ebooks. This isn't sponsored by them, I just use them all the time, and it's free, so definitely check it out if you can. I don't know how it works if you don't have a library card. However, I think the library card is $1 to $2, so you have free access for life. So I listened to So You Want to Talk About Race. I really enjoyed listening to this, and I love Ijeoma's voice. I just think that her voice is like, it's so soothing, and it's fantastic. The book was about 7 hours long, and so I listened to it over the course of a couple days, and it was amazing. I really loved listening to her. It was a lot of short vignettes and chapters about her life, but also about how to approach race conversations in your everyday life. So it is nonfiction, and each chapter starts off with a question from someone who's taken a lot of classes in the humanities and liberal studies field, and also taking a lot of classes about race in literature and film and other types of media. A lot of these questions that she brought up were ones that I've already explored in my college education. However, she did go further in depth into them, which I really loved. I do really recommend this book, and I'm looking forward to reading more of her work or listening to more of her work in the future, and listening to other books of the sort. Personally, I am not a huge nonfiction person, so I like listening to them as audiobooks because I see it more like a podcast. I just have a harder time getting immersed into nonfiction as I do fiction books. However, her voice and her stories were just fantastically told, and I do really recommend this, and I gave it a 5 out of 5 stars. I cannot recommend this book enough. So the next book that I have for August is another audiobook, and this is a reread slash re-listen as well. It is Little House in the Big Woods by Laura Ingalls Wilder, which is the first book in the Little House on the Prairie series. So this book was published first in 1932, and like I said, it's the first of the series. I loved these books so much. I had the complete set when I was younger, and I devoured them. My mom read them to me, I read them to myself, I watched the TV show. My favorite thing about Wilder's writing is the descriptions of food. I think that the way that she describes cooking and how they farm their own food is just so romantic, and I really love it. However, I would like to note that there is a lot of very racist stuff in these books. I'd love to find other books that have a similar vibe to Little House on the Prairie that don't contain those, and I would really love to find books of this time period from Native American authors. So if you have any suggestions, please let me know down below. I didn't even explain what the Little House on the Prairie series is. I feel like a lot of people probably know because it is a very popular series about Laura Ingalls Wilder's childhood. So she grew up in Wisconsin, and this story takes place in the 1870s, and she published it later on in her life in the 1930s. They're autobiographical, but they're more like children's stories, so it's not like a memoir necessarily. It's written as if it's a children's story, so it is very romantic, and I think that's part of the problem with the way that she talks about Native Americans. Please let me know if you have any stories, like children's stories about Native Americans or Indigenous people anywhere in the world, because I would really love to read them.
I've also decided to not include my star rating for this book either, because I'm afraid that my nostalgia with this book is going to skew my rating, and I want it to be honest, so I'm going to leave my rating out, but do your own research before you read.
Starting in September, I have finally some comics and graphic novels. The first one that I have is Over the Garden Wall Volume 1. This comic is beautiful. I love Over the Garden Wall. As you know, it is one of my favorite cartoons and shows of all time. It was a mini series that aired on Cartoon Network. It was only 10 episodes, and it is fantastic. I highly recommend you watch it. It is available on Hulu, or you could get it from a library if you don't have access to Hulu. The comics are a continuation of Wirt and Greg's adventures in the unknown. Wirt and Greg are brothers, and the unknown is a magical forest that all sorts of crazy things happen in. I feel like the comics are a lot more ambiguous than the cartoon is, and I personally like a little more clarity. I love soft world building personally, however this I had a hard time following. I gave it a 2.5 out of 5 stars. The storyline was a little confusing, and I did ultimately decide to not finish reading the series after the second volume, which is coming up later on in the year. I do recommend them if you want to continue reading on with Greg and Wirt as characters. It is a great fall and autumn time read, and I got them from the library. Next up, I have another copy of this one now, and I talked about this in my books that I had to read in school. It is The Glass Castle by Jeanette Walls, and it was published in 2005. Glass Castle is a memoir, so it's nonfiction. However, it's like a different type of nonfiction. Memoirs are very different in my realm of understanding of nonfiction. Like, I feel like it's more just like a novel, which is right up my alley. This book recounts her unconventional upbringing with her family as they travel around the United States. Her parents have a very tumultuous relationship with each other and with their children, and Jeanette and her 3 siblings kind of have to end up taking care of each other while their parents are not really doing the parenting job. We follow Jeanette from when she was 3 years old up until adulthood. It is a really heartbreaking book to read, a big trigger warning for abuse and sexual violence, but I do think it is a fantastic read. I read it for my child development class at Sonoma State, which is the college I go to now. I'm really happy that I got a chance to read it, and it did make it onto my top bookshelf of my favorite books, so definitely check it out. I got this used from Thrift Books, and I am really happy that I own a copy of it now. I gave it a 5 out of 5 star rating. I am so impatient. I cannot let my camera charge for more than like 30 minutes before I have to get up and keep going. So all that I read in October was Over the Garden Wall Volume 2. I'm not going to talk about it much more since I already kind of talked about Over the Garden Wall in my previous month where I was talking about Over the Garden Wall. My opinion still stands, and I gave it a 2.5 out of 5. The next book on my list is I Am Malala by Malala Yousafzai. I think we all are aware of how influential Malala is in her life and her story, and I got this book as a gift last year for Christmas, and I read it over the course of the summer, and I finished it in November, and I really enjoyed reading this. It took quite a while from the beginning because there was a lot of information about people's namesakes, about her grandparents, about the history of the valley that she grew up in Pakistan, and so there was just a lot of information given, and it reads very much like a traditional nonfiction book and less so like a memoir. It was amazing reading this and getting kind of a typical teenager perspective from Malala, because I have really only heard her speak in very professional environments, and so it was really fun and entertaining to hear about her life just as a teenager prior to the assassination attempt in 2012 on her life. This book follows from way before she was born to the beginning of the valley that she lives in, Swat Valley in Pakistan, the history of her parents and her grandparents, her and her siblings, all the way to her life currently in Birmingham, UK. Another thing that I really loved is there are some family photos in this book that are just really lovely pictures, and it was great to see a side of her that wasn't so professional that we see on TV and interviews. So I highly recommend this book. So I am giving it a 4 out of 5. Mostly because it reads more like a traditional nonfiction book, and I think I would personally have enjoyed it more if I listened to it as an audiobook. However, it is still amazing and I do really recommend that you read it. The next 2 books on my list for November are 2 more graphic novels slash comics, and they are the Avatar: The Last Airbender comics, book 1 and book 2, which are titled The Search and The Promise. And I read them back to back. I got them from the library, and I got the art book editions, which have notes in the margins from both the creators and the artists, and they have a lot of preliminary sketches in the back, which are really cool to look at. I really love Avatar. I've talked about it quite a bit recently. Avatar has been one of my new obsessions for the year. I'm so happy that I finally got to watch it, and I've watched it twice now this year, and I am on my second watch of Legend of Korra, and I am so excited to continue to read the comics. If you liked Avatar, I highly recommend reading the comics. For me personally, I have a hard time reading comics online. I just don't get the same experience, so I ordered mine from my local library, and I'm waiting for the 3rd comic to come to my library. I'm on a wait right now. I am the 4th person in line. However, if you don't mind reading comics online, I have a link below to all of the comics that are online for free that you can go ahead and look at if you'd like. But if you're like me and you want the hard copy, just check out your library and see if they have them. The first one, which is called The Promise, a lot of them are about Zuko and Aang's relationship, trying to rebuild after the 100 Years' War. And both Zuko and Aang have different opinions on how to rebuild after the war and what to do about the Fire Nation colonies in the Earth Kingdom. And it's a really interesting perspective on like a fictional fantasy colonization and how they are going to help everybody that's involved, and it's really interesting. It also sparks the beginning of Katara and Aang's relationship, which is really fun to watch. Everybody's there, Toph and Sokka and Suki, like everyone's there. Really love the comics, and they're drawn and created by the original creators of Avatar, so the drawing style is the same. Everyone is written in the way that they would be. I mean, it is canon, so it is the continuation from the original series. I gave both of them a 5 out of 5, as I would the entire Avatar series. I highly recommend that you read them, especially if you liked Avatar. It picks up right where the end of season 3 of Avatar left off, and I cannot wait to get the 3rd book because I'm going to read them all this next year. The first book that I read in December, which really kicked off a big reading kick for me, Sorcery of Thorns by Margaret Rogerson. Okay, so this year I discovered Carrie Cakes, or Carrie Can Read, on YouTube and Instagram, and I love her very much. I think she's very sweet. One of her videos is linked down below about Eleanor and Park that I mentioned earlier in the video, but she's given me a lot of great reading recommendations, and I have a lot of them planned for 2021. I ordered some from the library and thrift books, and I got this from the library and I loved it so much that I bought myself a copy from thrift books. Like I said, it's called Sorcery of Thorns, and it's actually published this summer in June of 2020, and it is about our protagonist, whose name is Elizabeth, and she was a foundling in this fantasy universe at this library, and all orphan foundling children are typically brought to libraries, and books are not just like any old books in this magical world. They are alive, and you have to take care of them and make sure that they're happy and healthy, otherwise they can turn into monsters, essentially. There is a sorcerer whose name is Nathaniel. From the beginning, she has been taught and raised that sorcerers are evil and none of them can be trusted, and she learns that there is obviously nuance in everyone, and she has to trust a sorcerer when she is accused of a crime. And this was a really quick read. I read it in, I mean, it's a fairly large book, and I read it in the span of a few days. I'm someone who likes to kind of space out my reading. I do like a little bit every morning, and I really loved this book. I thought Elizabeth and Nathaniel. Okay, real quick though, I feel like every time there's an Elizabeth in a book, there's also a Nathaniel. Is that just me, or are those names like so common together? Anyway, I feel like both of them are super charismatic. We get some bisexual representation and it is just a great time. So I love Sorcery of Thorns, and I ordered An Enchantment of Ravens by the same author, Margaret Rogerson, to read next year, and I'm really excited to do so. I gave Sorcery of Thorns a 4.5 out of 5 stars. The next book on my list is one that I got for Christmas this year, and I read it on Christmas Day. It is Lightfall by Tim Probert. Lightfall was published this year in 2020. I believe it was published in September, and it is a graphic novel, and I read it in one sitting on Christmas Day under the Christmas tree, and the illustrations in this are absolutely beautiful. I am a sucker for graphic novels with beautiful illustrations. Lightfall follows our protagonist, whose name is Bee, and her newfound friend, whose name is Cad. This is the first book in a future series. However, this has only been published this year, so the second book is not out yet, unfortunately. However, when it is out, I'm totally gonna buy it. Bee and her new friend Cad are on the hunt for Bee's grandfather, who is the pig wizard. He adopted Bee when she was young, and he has gone missing, and he's a very forgetful pig wizard man. So Bee is really worried about where he is. And on their journey through this magical world, we get to see lots of glimpses of the world building for their magical place. The characters are so fun. I love Cad. He's great. Bee is super charismatic and silly. She's just, you know, the best quirky kid character you could have in a graphic novel. I gave Lightfall a 5 out of 5 rating. I read it in maybe 40 minutes and I enjoyed every second of it. I'm hoping to read it again before I get the second one. Next up is Howl's Moving Castle by Diana Wynne Jones. Howl's Moving Castle was published in 1986, and as you're probably noticing, Howl's Moving Castle is a Studio Ghibli film, which is one of my favorites, and the film was inspired by the book, very loosely, however. So this book was recommended Carrie from Carrie Loves to Read, which I'll have her channel linked down below. If you're not following her already, you obviously should be. I was actually a little bit disappointed by the book version. I think because I watched the film first, and I have such high expectations from Ghibli films from their source material, I was a little bit confused because there was a lot going on in this book. It is also very 1980s, which also might be part of the problem. Maybe I just don't like books from the 1980s. Howl's Moving Castle follows our protagonist, who is named Sophie Hatter, and she's 18 years old, and she is a hatter. She makes hats, and she has 2 sisters and a stepmother, and they own a hat shop. The wizard Howl, who is kind of like this looming character, it's kind of a tale where they live that the wizard eats young girls' hearts. He like woos them and then eats their hearts. So there's also this witch whose name is the Witch of the Waste, and she shows up and turns Sophie into an old woman. And Sophie inevitably finds this gigantic moving castle, which is Howl's Moving Castle, and she becomes kind of like the cleaning lady of the house, and takes care of Howl and his apprentice, whose name is Michael. Sophie makes a deal with Calcifer, who is a fire demon. He is Howl's fire demon, that Calcifer will help change Sophie back into her youthful self if Sophie can break contract between Calcifer and Howl. However, part of the contract says Calcifer nor Howl are allowed to tell Sophie how to break the contract. So she's trying to figure it out, and while she's being an old woman. Sophie is hilarious. I love Sophie. I love a lot of the characters in this. The characters are great. However, the plot was just confusing because it is so different from the film, in my opinion. I'm giving the book a 3.5 out of 5 stars, I know, and I give the film a 5 out of 5, obviously, because the film is one of my favorites. But if you do like the film, I recommend giving the book a shot, but it just wasn't really for me. I was a little confused. The last book that is actually one that at the time of recording this I haven't finished. Today is December 30th, but I'm going to finish it tonight, and it is another graphic novel, and it is called The Prince and the Dressmaker, which my sibling bought for me at the bookstore that they work for. It is, like I said, it's a graphic novel about a prince who wants to wear dresses to a ball. So after I finish reading it, I'll insert a little review and my star rating now.
Hello, so it is the day that I'm editing this, and I've just realized I didn't talk about The Prince and the Dressmaker yet. So The Prince and the Dressmaker is by Jen Wang. It was published in 2018, and like I said, it's a graphic novel. I really enjoyed this graphic novel. I read it on New Year's Eve, and it was really really enjoyable. It was geared a little older than I thought it was going to be. I thought it was going to be more for a younger audience, but the illustrations are great. The characters are great. I felt a lot for both of our protagonists, and I thought that they had good chemistry together. I will say there is a trigger warning for being outed in this book, so fair warning to anybody reading. However, I feel like it addresses topics of gender in a fantasy world really interestingly, and I did really enjoy it, and I do recommend it, and I'm giving it a 4.5 out of 5 stars.
Thank you so much for watching this video. I know it was very, very long. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you got some ideas of some books that I enjoyed this year. Please let me know if you've read any of the books that I mentioned and what your favorite book was that you read this year as well, because I'm always looking for more recommendations. And in 2021, I have a long list of books started, of books that I'd love to read, stuff on hold, stuff coming in from thrift books. I'm very excited, and I'm excited to do a lot more book videos in the future. I hope that you have a great start to 2021 and get some good reading in, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!